we're going to be talking about the Spanish Civil War and Spanish Revolution. This is a talk I've wanted to do for quite some time just because I'm personally interested in this. The dates of what we're talking about is in the 1930s, and more specifically like 1936 to 1939, right before World War II. I think the importance of talking about this is it shows the struggle of the working class in the early 1900s. It shows the arguments that were on the left and the development of new working class enemies, Stalinists and fascists. So just a little bit of an overview. I'm going to touch on the background, some events leading up to the Civil War and during the Civil War and Revolution, some of the rivaling political ideologies, some social and cultural dimensions, outside intervention, and legacy and lessons learned. So just a little background, Spain is an imperial power. From the late 1400s to the 1800s, Spain colonized much of the Americas. By the 1820s, independence movements liberated former Spanish colonies, such as those in Mexico, Central America, and South America, not what became Brazil. These movements tended to be bourgeois in nature, and this was a loss of income and status for Spain in losing these colonies. In the 1890s, in an independence movement in Cuba led to U.S. intervention. This became the Spanish-American War. Really, the Americans co-opted the Cuban independence movement. But by 1900, as a result of America winning this war, Spain lost most of its last colonies in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, which all went to the U.S. And this further bankrupted Spain and caused it to decline into this backwards monarchy that it became by the early 1900s. Also, by the early 1900s, Spain maintained a colony or started a colony in northern Morocco. This is significant because this is where Franco's military base comes from initially. So moving on, just a couple of maps. The one on the right here shows in this reddish color the Republican or centrist and sometimes leftist side in reddish. So you see those areas. And then the blue and the tan is the nationalist areas, also associated with the fascists. Looking at the map with the regions, I think it's important to point out Catalonia, because this is where a lot of the revolutionary activity happened, especially around Barcelona, and where, if you watch the movie Land and Freedom, which I recommended, takes place mainly around Catalonia and around Barcelona. Some other areas that are notable is Madrid, the capital, right in the middle. A lot of more Republican-controlled center of political, political discussion and things like that. I'm going to talk about the Asturias at one point. Here it is up here. This is where an early revolt happened. So just to give an idea of the lay of the land, moving on and talking about the organizations and sides in the war, the best way to think about this is it's like a three-way civil war. The revolutionaries and the Republicans at times were together fighting the fascists, but at times they were in direct armed conflict with each other. There was some sharing of supplies and crossover of groups and members, especially on a local level. So in talking about the left and revolutionaries, there's the POUM, which is featured in Land and Freedom. This is the Trotskyist-leaning Communist Party, and they're revolutionary socialists. Out of all these groups, they're the one most closely associated politically with, more similar to like Firebrand and Denver Communists, more than the other ones, not completely. But also, in addition to them on the left, we can't forget the anarcho-syndicalists, because that was the majority of this leftist revolutionary side. It was not the socialists, it was the anarchists. And the CNT and the FAI are the two main organizations. The CNT, Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, is the union that the anarcho-syndicalists use. And to talk about anarcho-syndicalism real quick, it's anarchism based on revolutionary workers' unions. kind of similar to Soviets in some ways. It's anarchism with a working class focus is how I like to think about it. It's still anarchism and at conflict with democratic socialism and Stalinism, things like that. Lastly, the Alianza Obrera. This is the organization, the Workers' Alliance, and that kind of moves from the left to the centrist at times. In the centrist or Republican side, the Popular Front was the alliance of all the Republican parties. It was supported by the USSR, and it was mainly Stalinist, Marxist, Leninist, at times, kind of reformist. The PSOE is the biggest socialist organization in Spain at this time, and they're like a Spanish Socialist Party. They're democratic socialist and more reformist. Later on, they're not strong in the beginning, but later on during the Civil War, the PCE or Spanish Communist Party comes more into influence, and they are more aligned with Stalin and identifies more Stalinist, Marxist, Leninist. The UGT is the National Workers Union, and this is the union associated with the PSOE. On the right or nationalist side, we have CETA, which is a right-wing coalition, and the Falange Party, which is the fascist party of Spain, the Catholic Church, and the military. Anyway, moving on. Spain up to the 1930s, the old monarchy was supported by the Catholic Church, aristocratic office corps, the bourgeoisie, the military. The turn to military support led to the dictatorship of General Miguel Primo de Rivera. That's the guy top right. Rising struggle and Great Depression, though, forced Primo de Rivera to resign. In 1930, King Alfonso XIII, bottom right, called for democratic elections leading to the Second Republic. Notable that the First Republic in 1873 only lasted a year, and in 1931, the Republicans are elected. This is the centrists, and Alfonso flees the country. The government of Manuel Azaña on the left there was a coalition of middle-class Republican parties in the right wing of the Spanish Socialist Party. There was a tremendous outpouring of solidarity and unity, celebrations around the country, calls for unity of left parties in the struggle for democracy, but there were some cracks. Republican forces were smaller middle-class parties opposed to monarchy and dictatorship, but they're still defending Spanish capitalism, nationalist parties in the PSOE. Within the PSOE, there's a divide, those who want gradual reform, reformists, and those who see a need for revolution, revolutionaries or revolutionary socialists. So there's debate with even the PSOE. Outside of the Republican government, as I mentioned, were anarcho-syndicalist unions, such as the CNT, and they stood for the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, and they were against participation in political action. This will come up later. The left agreed the main issues facing the revolution were the questions of democracy, land reform, and challenging Spanish capitalism. Land reform being the most pressing issue. Agricultural products were half of Spain's income. 70% of the population worked the land. There was a small class of landowners that controlled 2/3 of arable land, mostly in large estates. Peasants demanded the confiscation of large estates and redistribution of land to poor peasants. Land was mortgaged by Spanish banks, so redistribution would challenge Spanish capitalism. The Republicans wanted to avoid this and wanted to avoid redistribution, and they made calls for patience and sacrifice. The government became paralyzed. The workers and peasants elected it, but the Republicans defended the bourgeoisie. The government couldn't really carry through these reforms. Working class organization. Bailey makes some of these arguments, which I agree with during in his articles, one of the two of the articles that I recommended. He says that reforms had to be defended and extended by working class organizations. The working class needed to confront the bourgeois government to strengthen the working class movement. They needed to fight for workers' power and socialism and for a less repressive state. The working class was the only class capable of leading the fight for democratic demands for the peasantry and oppressed minorities. The working class had to fight for its own socialist aspirations. Crisis for the Second Republic. Between 1931 and 1933, anarchists and working class revolutionaries clashed with the Republican Azania government. The Civil Guard, to summarize this, the Civil Guard shot workers, there were strikes, the government declared martial law, workers were killed or injured, anarchists launched counterattacks because they were committed to militant direct action. This was often suppressed by the government. Anarchists in Casas Viejas rose up and seized land. The government sent in the military. Hundreds were killed and some were burned alive. Pictures of this massacre infuriated the public. Union militants were arrested, and for the time being, the anarchist wave was extinguished. With the anarchists in retreat and the PSOE discredited, the right wing took initiative. The right wing had contempt for the peasantry, but they used the massacre to embarrass the Republican Azania government. The right won the November 1933 elections, and they called the starting of this period, or this period is called El Bienio Negro, the 2 black years. Alejandro Lerroux headed the government during this right-wing phase, and this is with the backdrop of the rise of fascism in Europe, Hitler being elected chancellor, Engelbert Dollfuss becoming dictator in Austria. Seats in the Congress went to SEDA. This is the right-wing organization I mentioned earlier. And they're made up of industrialists, monarchists, and admirers of Mussolini, Hitler, and Dollfuss. Membership of the PSOE and the affiliated union, the UGT, became radicalized by the failure of Germany's social democrats to resist the rise of fascism. So this is referring to the failed German Revolution, where the SPD split with the revolutionaries. A talk for another time. But this radicalized folks even in Spain. Some radicals declared that they were preparing for a proletarian revolution. There was call for formation of a broad united front of workers' organizations, and this was the Alianza Obrera to resist the right. The Lerroux government collapsed, but SEDA took cabinet positions. Alianza Obrera and UGT called a nationwide general strike, but it was mostly a failure. Because the PSOE, they didn't fully commit to the strike, they postponed it twice, and they also tried to negotiate with the government. When they finally made the call for this strike, it was on short notice, and it was followed by a declaration of martial law. So talking about the Asturias revolt, only at this time, only in the mining center of the Asturias did strike take revolutionary proportions, and this is in 1934. The local UGT and the CNT entered into the Alianza Obrera under pressure from rank and file. They signed a pact to work together until a social revolution in Spain. On October 4th, the strike began. Joint militias attacked barracks of civil guards and disarmed them. Miners marched on the capital Oviedo, liberating towns along the way and building forces. They took control of cities, redistributed land to peasants, and they seized mines and factories. 8,000 miners took Oviedo for 15 days, and they held it against the troops of the Foreign Legion. A slaughter followed. 3,000 were killed and thousands were imprisoned. The October Rebellion showed a potential of a united workers' movement and the desire for unity among the many rank and file, among the rank and file workers from all parties. The PSOE and CNT leaders divided forces of the working class. So one thing to note is that on the local level, things are happening typically a little bit more radically, and there's more alliances where nationally these organizations such as the anarchists and the social democrats don't really want to work together on a nationwide political level. But on the local level, it's a little different. So the national CNT, this is the anarcho-syndicalists, their leadership rejected the call for united action through the Alianza Obrera. They dismissed calls for unity in political struggle. They turned their backs on millions of workers in the struggle against the right. They opposed the participation also of this pro-state PSOE, the Social Democrats. The CNT hostility to socialists was fueled by the opportunism of the PSOE. The PSOE long abandoned revolutionary politics. They were reformist and centrist, and their leadership saw the Alianza Obrera as a paper alliance. For the LaRue government and the right, they had all been discredited, and the Asturias Rebellion was the beginning of the end. A new militancy was growing among workers and peasantry. New elections were coming, and the left would win. The right was temporarily defeated, but it was making plans for a coup with General Francisco Franco. Lead up to the coup, the elections of 1936 were again celebrated by workers across Spain, just like in 1930. The previous 2 years, the Black years, the right-wing government had savagely attacked workers and peasants' living standards. Leftists and Republicans were purged from the military, universities, and the public sector. So now the Popular Front, they're not radical. This is an electoral alliance of middle-class left Republican parties, the PSOE, the small Spanish Communist Party, and some regional nationalist parties. They wanted amnesty for Asturias political prisoners that were jailed in 1934, and they wanted land reform and renewed autonomy for Catalonia. Workers saw the Popular Front victory in more far-reaching terms. They saw it as a continuation of the revolution that started in 1930. One Madrid socialist put it, the workers wanted to go forward. They weren't satisfied with the release of political prisoners and the return to their jobs of all those who had been sacked as a result of the revolutionary insurrection of October 1934. Instinctively, they were pressing forward, not necessarily to take power, not to create Soviets, but to push forward the revolution, which had begun with the Republic proclamation. So the coup begins. The right wing saw the Popular Front victory as a declaration of war. They began plans right after the election for a coup. In July 17, 1936, General Francisco Franco launched an uprising led by his army in Spanish Morocco. And as I mentioned, he had a well-trained, experienced, organized, but most importantly, very loyal army to Franco. So that was a strategic advantage for him. They attacked the Popular Front government and working class organizations that had brought it to power. They seized control of the Seville garrison, declared that labor union or striking leaders would be shot. The coup got support from the right-wing parties and sections of the military, but it should have ended quickly. Bailey says, had the Popular Front government from the start armed the population, it could have quickly ended Franco's advance. Wherever workers were armed or able to seize them, the coup was pushed back. Franco sent soldiers throughout Aragon and Andalusia, where most of the radical peasant organizing happened, and they did take over those areas. Bailey goes on to say, if a government pushed through radical land reform in the countryside, it would have driven a wedge between the army command and rank and file soldiers, many of whom come from peasant families. If the Popular Front government had declared independence from Morocco, it could have rallied support from Moroccan nationalist forces and opened a second front against Franco's army. Towards revolution, the Popular Front government was paralyzed. They were defending Spanish capitalism and unwilling to push the class forward in a way to break fascist resistance. The Popular Front government tried to negotiate with the right. They tried to dissolve and form a coalition government. But the Popular Front authority was eroding. The right wing had abandoned the government in support of the coup. The bourgeoisie, some of them fled abroad and took money with them. Military and the police went with the coup rebels, of course. As old society fell apart, workers' movements organized new structures in its place. Unions commandeered trucks to transport newly formed workers' militias. They formed ambulance services, worker-run hospitals, communal kitchens, transportation centers. They took over factories, put them under workers' control, and they elected representatives to oversee production and coordinate work in the shops. These are examples of worker class self-organization and self-emancipation, democracy in action. We've seen this in the past in the Russian Revolution with the Soviets. We've seen it in Hungary with their workers' councils, in Iran with the Shoras, Solidarność in Poland, the Cordónes in Chile. So we've seen this a lot before, where workers can take power. George Orwell arrived in Barcelona 6 months after the uprising. He wrote Homage to Catalonia, and this is a quote from him. It was the first time I'd ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. Practically every building of any size had been seized by the workers and was draped with the red flags or the red and black of the anarchists. Every wall was scrawled with the hammer and sickle with the initials of the revolutionary parties. Every shop and cafe had an inscription saying that it had been collectivized. Even the bootblacks had been collectivized and their boxes painted red and black. Waiters and shop walkers looked at you in the face and treated you as an equal. There was much in it that I didn't understand. In some ways, I did not even like, but I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for. In the countryside, peasants took control of the land, redistributing estates, collectivizing land, and setting up communes. Orwell goes on to say, on July 22nd, the big landowners were expropriated, small property was liquidated, and all the land passed into the hands of the commune. The local treasury was empty. Among private individuals, the sum of 30,000 pesetas in all was found and seized. All the food, the tools were distributed equitably among the population. Money was abolished, labor was collectivized, property taken over by the community, and the distribution of consumer goods was socialized. 3 liters of wine are distributed to every person every week. Rent, electricity, water, medical attention, and medicines are free. In talking about counter-revolution, so we see this happening, and again in the movie, some of this is depicted. When we're talking about the counter-revolution, the Popular Front tried to hold back the revolution and had contempt for it since the beginning. They had little mass support, and they held on to power by left-wing parties. But the Spanish Communist Party joined leadership in defending the Republican parties. So before they were insignificant, failed to gain a following, but after Stalin's rise to power, it abandoned revolutionary struggle and became a tool of Soviet foreign policy. Stalin hoped to win support of the Allies to join in a coalition against fascism. This is at a time when the USSR is facing hostility from the Nazis. The Popular Front passed restrictions against peasants seizing land, workers running factories, and passed laws protecting foreign-held property. The Popular Front felt it had to restrain workers' and peasants' demands to gain unity from all anti-fascist supporters, including the bourgeoisie. This held back revolution and undermined the struggle against Franco and the far right. Franco had support from the army, from the bourgeoisie, and he also had military support from the fascist governments in Italy and Germany. Trotsky at this time is hanging out in Mexico. He's in exile because Stalin's trying to kill him, or will. And in this picture, he's with his wife, Frida Kahlo, and the president of Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas. I'll talk about that a little later. Trotsky thought, so he's in Mexico and observing this, from a distance. He thought that the revolution didn't have the military upper hand, but that they could rouse the masses into action. He says a civil war is waged, as everyone knows, not only with the military, but also with political weapons. From a purely military point of view, the Spanish Revolution is much weaker than its enemy. Its strength, though, lies in its ability to rouse the great masses to action. It can even take away the army from its reactionary officers. To accomplish this, it is only necessary to seriously and courageously advance the program of the socialist revolution. In talking about dual power, the Popular Front still held power in Madrid. Resistance to Franco's forces left sections of the country under the control of the workers and peasants. In Barcelona, the regional Popular Front government was powerless. The CNT, or the anarcho-syndicalists, still held power within Barcelona and around Catalonia. They organized food, medical care, local committees to defend the revolution. They trained and armed militias to fight back Franco's coup. This was a classic case of dual power. the Popular Front was able to rule when they didn't contradict the hours of the local CNT. The Popular Front Catalonia government had called on CNT leaders to hold his office, offered to step down and turn over power to the CNT. The anarchists and the CNT, though, rejected any form of state power, even as a workers' state, because they saw it as a form of hierarchy. So they refused to take power, but the anarchists allowed, after debate, the Popular Front government to continue to rule. Trotsky criticized this, the anarchists, for this. He says, in and of itself, this self-justification that we did not seize power, not because we were unable, but because we did not wish to, because we were against every kind of dictatorship and the like, it contains an irrevocable condemnation of anarchism as an utterly anti-revolutionary doctrine. To renounce the conquest of power is to voluntarily leave the power with those who wield it, the exploiters. The essence of every revolution consists in putting a new class into power, thus enabling it to realize its own program in life. It is possible to wage war and to reject victory. It is impossible to lead the masses towards insurrection without preparing for the conquest of power. To expand the base of the Popular Front government, a new cabinet was formed with the left-wing leader of the PSOE, Caballero, as prime minister. He offered seats to the government in the CNT. The anarchists wanted to avoid the state and rely on power of local workers and peasants' committees to defend the revolution. But as we know, dual power cannot last indefinitely. Bailey says either revolutionary forces push forward and come into conflict with and eventually displace the state, or forces of the old order would recapture and strangle the revolution. The PCE and the PSOE gained influence in the government with their ability to provide money and weapons through the USSR, and they gained control over government supply lines and weapons. They starved the revolutionary militias of provisions and arms. The anarchists previously renounced overthrowing the state. Now they tried to collaborate with it. And Caballero gave 4 seats in his government to the CNT. Despite the failures of the left-wing parties, workers and the peasants showed incredible courage and sacrifice in opposition to Franco. When Franco's forces attacked Madrid, the newly formed Caballero government fled the capital with the leaders of the unions, political parties, but not the communists. Abandoned by the government, Madrid scrambled to build defenses, and workers made calls to defend the city. A common slogan was, better to die than to live on your knees. Pretty similar to around, just 10 years earlier. Blanking on the guy's name. Never mind, sorry. Anyway, the Union of Streetcar Workers ran free shuttles to move militias. For weeks, workers fought the fascists street by street, house by house, showing incredible heroism. No pasarán, they shall not pass, was a common phrase. So on this banner over here, it says, no pasarán, el fascismo quiere conquistar Madrid, Madrid será la tumba del fascismo. So this is, they shall not pass. Fascism wants to conquer Madrid. Madrid will be the grave for fascism. I really like that slogan on that banner. After a month of fighting, Franco's forces retreated. The PCE benefited the most from the defense of Madrid. They used the press to show the heroism of the PCE-controlled international brigades, and they received support from the USSR, that made the USSR look good as well. We kind of see some of this depicted as well in the movie. After the defense of Madrid, the PCE used its newfound popularity to begin to take control of the Popular Army and police forces, recruiting or winning support from the right wing of the PSOE. They used influence to withhold ammunition and supplies from workers' militias of the CNT and the PUM, who was the small anti-Stalinist party based mainly in Catalonia. So the PCE wanted to starve the revolution and gain control from the CNT and the PUM. So just to clarify, the USSR is backing the support of the Social Democrats and mix of Marxist-Leninists to not give weapons at times intentionally to the more revolutionaries who are fighting the fascists on the front line. We see that in the movie. Revolution and defeat. Barcelona was the heart of revolutionary Spain. The revolution was rolled back throughout the rest of the country. The CNT and the workers' militias controlled most aspects of daily life, but the regional government was slowly trying to get back power. There were feelings of political rivalry, and May 3rd, assault guards under the command of the PCE arrived at the telephone exchange held by the CNT. This was a visible symbol of workers' power in the city. This is the scene in the movie where the Stalinist or Popular Front army is shooting the anarchists, and there's a woman in the courtyard below. And this is where the main character questions his allegiance to the Popular Front. Weeks of street fighting between the anarchists and PCE militants, and there was spontaneous uprisings in Barcelona. It had support of the workers in Catalonia, but this provocation by the government was intended of an act of war against the revolution. Catalonia could get support, but defeat would mean the end of the revolution, and the Popular Front brought in the CNT leadership to try to disarm the local CNT, and eventually that's what happened. And the CNT leadership, the CNT militants retreated in frustration and disgust because they weren't supported by their leadership. And the revolution in this moment had been defeated. In the following months, the revolutionary leaders were hunted down, jailed, tortured, and murdered. Revolutionary committees were broken up. Popular militias were disbanded and reintegrated into the regular army. The war would continue, but the defeat of Barcelona sealed its fate. In 1938, Franco's forces marched into Barcelona, and there was no organized opposition. Revolutionaries didn't just want to defeat Franco. They hoped that the victory would have reorganized society to become more just and democratic. So talking about the POUM, again, this is the more Trotskyist-leaning organization I mentioned. They're more closer politically to Denver Communists and Firebrand. They formed as a fusion of the Trotskyist communist left of Spain, Izquierda Comunista de España, and the Workers and Peasants Bloc, the BOC. The ICE broke with Trotsky. The POUM was formed as a communist opposition to the Stalinist form of the USSR, and their leaders were strongly influenced by Trotsky and his permanent revolution theory. The merging of the left and right oppositions, though, was against Trotsky's wishes. But the POUM grew larger than the PCE, especially in Catalonia and Valencia, and they criticized the Popular Front strategy, but they participated in the Azania Popular Front government at times. They tried to implement radical policies, but this was resisted by the centrist factions of the Popular Front. George Orwell, the author, he had volunteered at this time to fight in the POUM like a lot of others did, the main character in the movie. His experience influenced his writing and political beliefs, which inspired him to write Homage to Catalonia, 1984, Animal Farm, and he became an anti-Stalinist revolutionary socialist from this experience, and I believe was even shot in the neck. In 1937, or by 1937, they had up to 40,000 members. The Popular Front Coalition attacked the POUM in Barcelona. The CNT supported the POUM at first. So at first, the anarchists and the POUM were on the same side, and they fought, on the front lines together. But as the POUM became isolated with other groups, Trotskyism was attacked by Stalinists, and the POUM was forced to go underground. I wanted to touch on women and queer people in the Spanish Revolution. This wasn't really discussed a lot in the Bailey articles, but I caught a really good working class histories podcast, which is also on YouTube. I can share that, where they talk about some of this. Women hoped to gain equal rights through the revolution. In some cases, they gained access or rights for abortion. They talk about in Working Class History podcast that women were used in propaganda, that these iconic images that we see were used to, they say, guilt men into joining the war by challenging their masculinity. Women did fight in the beginning of the war. We see that depicted in the movie. But there was a campaign against women saying that they were distracting men on the front lines. And this came from the Popular Front, the Republican government, as well as from Stalin. So women wanted to be treated equal on the front lines, but as we saw in the movie, they were, pushed into being nurses and non-fighting positions. Some women, though, did become key figures in the movement leadership. Queer people in the revolution, homophobia was widespread in society at the time, but there were prominent lesbian and gay individuals involved in the revolution, such as Luis Sanchez Serranil, who formed Mujeres Libres, and Federico Garcia Lorca, who was a gay socialist playwright. He was kidnapped and murdered by nationalists. His remains were never found, pretty terrible. And he was a good friend of Salvador Dali, which I'll talk about in a second. Outside intervention, it's important to note that fascist Germany and Italy supported Franco and the Flange during the war. The Flange was the fascist party of Spain with strong ties to the military and the Catholic Church. Germany and Italy intervened specifically in the bombing of Guernica. Mexico and the USSR were the only countries to support the Republicans. The USSR was heavily influenced, they heavily influenced the Popular Front government, but they also withheld arms from the revolutionaries at the front pretty intentionally, and they prevented revolutionaries from going further. Mexico experienced its own revolution and civil war in the 19 teens to the 30s. Trotsky was in exile and welcomed by the Mexican government because they were more left-leaning at the time, but up until his assassination in 1940. The international brigades, up to 40,000 people had volunteered to fight from all over Europe, South America, Latin America, even Asia, and the Middle East, all over the place. Salvador Dali made this painting, which was inspired by events leading up to the Civil War. He was a part of the artist community, and the artist community was mostly anti-fascist. In my research, though, I found out after the Civil War, he became a supporter of Franco and supported the fascists up to 1975, turning his back on friends like Federico Garcia Lorca, who was a socialist and his good friend. So kind of disappointing. Pablo Picasso made this painting inspired by that bombing of Guernica, pretty well-known anti-war painting, or piece of art, I should say. The legacy, Franco was the head of state and a dictator until his death in 1975. So let that sink in. The Popular Front and the Stalinists that supported, fighting the revolution and allowed the fascists to take power, those fascists stayed in power up until 1975. Even after World War II, when most other fascist countries, had become bankrupt or had been defeated by the Allies. So let that sink in. Claude Bowers, U.S. ambassador to Spain, called the Civil War a dress rehearsal for World War II. 400,000 people left Spain in 1939 as the fascists won the war. Many revolutionaries were forced to go underground or in exile. This was a loss of skilled intellectuals, artists, teachers, professors, politicians, and other professionals. So Spain was economically torn apart and thus did not fight in World War II. They did, though, support Italy and Germany. The Flange sent military support to Germany to fight the USSR. Nationalists were rewarded jobs in the new government. So I'm getting down to my last couple of slides. Bailey, I like how he ends his article. Today, a new generation fights in its battles for democracy. The lessons of Spain remain. In virtually every revolutionary situation, revolution begins with a period of unity of all those opposed to the old order. Workers in the left are told to moderate their demands in order to preserve that initial unity. But revolutions cannot be made halfway. Either the revolutionary movement goes forward, moves forward and begins to challenge the limits of the existing capitalist system, or the old forces begin to claw back control either through the outright victory of the counter-revolution or through the co-optation of more conservative sections of the movement. The victories of the revolution can only be secured by deepening and extending the revolutionary movement. Although the revolution in Spain was ultimately defeated, it provides a glimpse into what such a process might look like. But it will be today in the streets of Cairo, Damascus, Athens, and here in the US that the process remains to be completed. Lessons learned for, revolutionaries specifically. In struggle, revolutionaries need to use a Marxist analysis to examine and consider any openings that could lead a working class to victory. This might mean taking political power, especially in instances of a power vacuum or a shift. This might mean at times taking positions of political office, using positions to encourage workers to take power, criticizing the government, pushing for immediate reforms to benefit workers, especially in times of revolution. We can discuss and debate that. Seizing workplaces and supporting workers in taking power, supporting workers in making decisions about resources, infrastructure, transportation, and such. Revolutionary socialists need to make arguments within the left to push it towards revolutionary action. The left needs to unite using the united front strategy to fight the right in fascism, not the popular front strategy, which led to a fascist victory. The Spanish Revolution showed that the working class struggle can push beyond borders to connect the struggle internationally. My resources and references, I used Land and Freedom, directed by Ken Loach. These two articles by Geoff Bailey were great. Firebrand's own Brian Kelly wrote a really great article called Syndicalism and Taking Power. I didn't get to touch on some of this, but it's great. Working Class History, as I mentioned, you can find this on YouTube or their podcast, and just a couple of other books that I used.